too hot to drink without slurping. Sorry. Oh, it's very hot, but perfect. That should last the evening. Good evening, everybody. Good evening, Mark UK, Tina Fey, Ricky Heath, Argy Bargy, Modi, Tina B, Savkin, Fee. Welcome to you all, and thank you for your prompt arrival on this evening's live stream. My special and new guest on the channel this evening, Suzanne, is waiting in the wings, just over here. Be with us in a minute. But before we bring Suzanne in, a couple of things that are in the news today I wanted to mention. And also, this is an unusual topic for us to do a live stream on. We're talking about lettings. We're talking about landlords and tenants. And if you've got questions, as a landlord or a tenant, please put them. I can't guarantee, and I'm sure Suzanne can't answer every single question there is, but we'll do our best. Please do them in the live chat and put the word question at the start. It makes it much easier when I'm scanning through, especially if there are a lot of comments, to spot the questions, and I can flag them and make sure that I don't miss your question if you've got a good question. We're going to be talking about the Renters Reform Bill and what that means if it happens. But just before we start, two things I thought would be worth sharing that I just saw recently. The first one is I've just seen a headline saying that Jeremy Hunt has hinted at an October general election. This has been reported on Bloomberg this evening. It's not confirmation, it's just a hint of an election on Bloomberg this evening, which would be interesting, because I wish they would just hurry up and let us know when it's going to be, because it really would help with everyone's planning, wouldn't it? So possibly a general election in October, which would be interesting for everyone to know, and then work around that. And then also on X, this follower of mine, Will Tremlett, who I'm pretty sure is an estate agent, if it's not that as a mortgage broker, but I think he's an estate agent, made this comment that I really thought actually chimed with how I'm seeing the market as well. The market is the most jittery I have seen in 30 years. That goes for vendors expecting miracles, to buyers being exceptionally measured, to inexperienced agents telling porkies. So there you have an agent talking about inexperienced agents telling porkies. I just thought those two things were interesting to note as we're live this evening. But without further ado, let me welcome Suzanne. Good evening, Suzanne. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello. Welcome
to Moving Home with Charlie. I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm glad we managed to finally get it set up. I'm sorry, the ball's been in my court for a long time to do that. So Suzanne, let me just quickly introduce you. So you were by career a lawyer, corporate lawyer, is that right?
Yeah.
And then you sort of, quotes, retired from that, and you decided to set up in business as a landlord. And I love the fact that you call it setting up business as a landlord. And you've got, I think if I'm right, you've got 4 properties that you rent out. And you started your blog and website called The Indie Landlord, where you share your tips on being a landlord with other landlords, and that's doing really well. And if you are a landlord and want to follow Suzanne, just I've put links to her website. You can follow her on X and also on Instagram below. By the way, those of you who are watching live on Instagram, if you want to be involved in the live chat, you need to switch over to either YouTube, preferably YouTube, that's the best place, or LinkedIn or Facebook or X. I can't get your comments on screen from Instagram if you're watching live on Instagram. But anyway, so yes, here we are this evening. You and I had a conversation earlier today, privately. It's the first time we've spoken. And I'm very keen, because I spend most of my time on the channel talking about buying and selling. But actually, as you know, my stated goal is a home for everyone. And of course, that absolutely includes lettings as well as sales. Can we just start with a couple of questions about the Renters Reform Bill? And if I may kick off by saying, first of all, we are assuming it's going to happen before the election because Michael Gove said it would. However, I think you were telling me earlier that unless they list it for parliamentary time this Thursday, you don't believe it will actually get done before the election. Is that right?
Yeah, it would be very touch and go, because it still hasn't gone through the House of Commons. It's at the final stage, and that after that it then has to go through the House of Lords. And because we've got Easter coming up, and then there's all sorts of bank holidays and things, and a long summer, they've got to get their skates on, otherwise it just won't make it in time, certainly not for October.
which I think would frustrate an awful lot of people, wouldn't it, if it doesn't happen? Especially given that it was sort of guaranteed, not guaranteed, but he committed to getting it done.
Well, yes, it was an election manifesto promise from 2019, and they were very clear about it. There's been a white paper, but it's been stop, go all the way through since the bill was published almost a year ago.
And let me ask you an unfair question, put you on the spot. If you had to pick which group are going to be the bigger beneficiaries of the renters reform bill, tenants or landlords, do you think? If you had to pick one, I know that there are things in there for both of them, but who do you think comes off better out of that?
I don't think it's a zero-sum game. I think that it does redress the balance between landlords and tenants, because at the moment tenants have no security as long as the landlord has complied with all the paperwork. The landlord can choose to serve notice at any time. And my children have been Section 21. One of them's been Section 21 twice. So I understand it. And when the Margaret Thatcher brought in this big reform in 1988, they didn't have Section 21 then. That came 10 years later. So if anything, what the Renters Reform Bill is trying to do is go back to what Margaret Thatcher brought in. But anyway, I think it will benefit renters more. It will give them more security of tenure. But on the other hand, landlords will be able to take possession if the renters don't pay the rent, or if they want to sell or move family in, and some other things as well.
Yes, well, I know there's a lot that goes into it. Am I right in saying that basically, and this is a massive generalization and oversimplification, but generally speaking, if you are a tenant who looks after the property and pays your rent on time, you will have more rights. If you're a tenant who breaks clauses of the lease or the tenancy agreement and is late with your rent, you're going to be less secure. Is that a rough generalization? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, kind of. I think probably all tenants are going to be more secure, because if you have a tenant that's not paying their rent, under the new system, the landlord will have to go to court under a procedure called Section 8. And so it's a lot harder. It will be a lot harder for landlords to regain possession if someone's not paying the rent, even if they improve the court system, which has massive delays at the moment. So, but it will give tenants more security of tenure. And I think that for society, that's a good thing. I don't know if I'm probably one of the only landlords that thinks that, but I do think that a more balanced relationship is a good thing, assuming we get the court system sorted so that when landlords have a good reason to terminate, they can.
100% agree with that. I mean, wouldn't it be lovely if tenants and landlords could deal with each other without using the court system?
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be nice if you didn't need to go to court every time a tenancy was to end or something was to change? You could just actually just discuss it in advance, come to a reasonable agreement, and try and stick to the agreement. I mean, that's with the landlords. And just so everyone knows, because a lot of you won't know this, I was a landlord. Actually, that's how I started in property back in the 90s, when things were much less regulated and rigid. Not for very long, but I have had the experience of a landlord, and I had a good experience as a landlord. I would also, because I've never done the video on this topic before on this channel, I would like to just state my position as far as the rental market is concerned. And I'm not suggesting that you have to agree or disagree or anything else, but I'd be interested to know your comments on it. So, because there are a very large number of people who have no prospect of buying a home, and because everybody needs a home, being able to rent somewhere to live is very important. Being able to rent somewhere secure, that you're going to be able to put roots down and feel secure and stable, so that you can invest your time and your energy into your career and into your family, into your friends and into your hobby. All of these things are things that are difficult to do if you don't feel secure in your home, if you feel like you're at risk of being thrown out. So for people who can't afford to buy for whatever reason, and there are people who don't want to buy as well, and don't want to take on a mortgage debt and the unflexibility of that, it's a life choice. Having good places to rent is, whether or not you agree with, think is a good thing, it's an unavoidable requirement of the current system in this country. Now, having said that, it is my view, and there is quite a lot of evidence to support it, that the more recent arrival of very low interest buy-to-let mortgages created a new breed of landlord who have been detrimental to the private rental sector in two ways. Number one, they have bought places that otherwise would probably have been bought by first-time buyers, and as a result have constricted the availability of homes for first-time buyers and contributed to prices going up. So I think that, now, I don't think all landlords are responsible for that at all, but I think the availability of cheap credit, allowing people who would otherwise never have been able to become a landlord to become landlords, has been a bad thing for house prices at the first-time buyer level, number one. And number two, actually, as you and I were discussing earlier, there are some of those landlords whose income margin is so thin once they've paid their fees and their mortgage costs that if they have a maintenance obligation under the terms of the tenancy agreement, for example, the boiler packs up and needs to be replaced, they actually can't afford it. And no regulation that currently exists makes sure that a landlord can actually meet their obligations. And so you've got a lot of landlords out there who can't meet those obligations when they come along. And also landlords who, because they've borrowed and the mortgage rate's gone up so much, they actually now can't afford to keep on paying their mortgage because the rent isn't high enough to cover the mortgage. And so the tenants in those situations have found themselves, through no fault of their own, in unstable accommodation, where either they're going to have to be moved out because the landlord's been forced to sell, or because the landlord can no longer afford to maintain the property to a livable standard. And so that advent of what I call the least Lambo Instagram landlords that are leveraged up to the hilt have been disastrous for the housing crisis as a whole. Now, one of the reasons I was keen to have you on here is because I've said publicly on this channel a number of times that I think that being a landlord is not an investment and shouldn't be viewed as an investment, and buying rental property is not an investment class, as with other investments where you just put your money somewhere and hope to get a return. I've always said that it is a high maintenance, high hassle occupation, which requires a lot more than just purchasing property and putting a tenant in. There are ongoing things, and that the best landlords are the ones who take the long-term view, which actually is good business anyway, fewer turnarounds, fewer voids, etc., and also see that they're in the business of providing stable homes. And fortunately, most landlords do that. We just don't hear much about those. We only hear about the really trouble ones. So that's my view. And so there are some people among my followers who have this sort of absolute can't bear the whole rental system, can't bear the concept of a landlord at all. And I hear what they say, but there is currently no alternative for people who can't afford to buy. There just isn't an alternative. But yeah, I'd love to know your take on that. So the low interest buy-to-let mortgages, that kind of stuff.
I mean, there certainly was a bubble, but certainly since 2015, when George Osborne brought in what's called Section 24, and it changed the amount of mortgage tax relief that a landlord can get, it just restricted it to 20%. It's been a lot harder for many landlords to make money, and so some have been leaving. What I think is at fault is when landlords enter it thinking it's passive income. It's not passive income. It's not like putting your money in the bank, and that is wrong. It's a wrong mindset. And unfortunately, there are people on YouTube who charge people lots of money to teach them how to do that. But I think that's the relative minority of landlords. Most of the landlords that I've come across are good landlords. They look after their tenants. I have lovely tenants. I manage my properties myself. I don't use letting agents, and they send. We have a very, very good relationship with them, and I welcome pets, I welcome families, and they're long-term tenants that live there for a long time. I look after the properties. It is a business. It takes me a fair bit of time. I take it seriously. And that's why I set up the blog called theindependentlandlord.com, is to use my kind of legal brain with the practical experience of me being there with the rubber gloves. If you don't believe me, look on Instagram. I do get there and do all the cleaning and stuff in between tenants. and the refurbs, but to try and help landlords become better landlords, so they can find information easily. They're not having to pay for anything. I don't charge. And because I think that most landlords actually are trying to do the right thing. There are a few rogues around the edges. The government figures estimates that to be 10%. So that means that that's in the English Private Landlord Survey. So that means 90% are good landlords. There are a number of landlords who maybe make mistakes, but their heart's in the right place. And they're the people that I've been trying to help with my blog, so that they can get reliable information and not just have to listen to any old nonsense that's on some Facebook groups.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's worth pointing out that if as a tenant you are fortunate enough to get a good and fair landlord, it's actually life-changingly good. There are people who, again, like I've said, don't want to buy for various reasons, want to have flexibility and freedom, but they do want stability at the same time as having flexibility. And a great landlord. I mean, I know people, friends of mine, who currently, multiple friends of mine who are currently enjoying a great relationship with a landlord through a period of turmoil. And it's working, and it's in both of their interests to do it, and they just talk. And if you just always talk, and I also know people where when a tenant wanted to talk to the landlord just said, no, don't talk to you, and that is incredibly foolish from a landlord's point of view. If your tenant is volunteering to come and say, hey, this is the situation, you can't bury your head in the landlord. Sorry, terrible Freudian slip. You can't bury your head in the sand as a landlord. It's just not going to go well.
It's not being customer focused. And I spent a long time in business. I was in the biotech industry, life sciences, and I saw that the companies that did really well were the ones that had the customer at the heart of every decision that they make. And that's what I think landlords need to do. We need to be having the renter experience at the heart of our decision making, not penny pinching on whose fault it is that the tap's broken, which is a type of thing that people talk about. If the tap breaks, it's my responsibility. I sort it out. My only problem is trying to get a tradesperson to come along and do it. They don't like small jobs. So actually, something I didn't mention to you, I've decided to start a City and Guilds course, handyman's course, so I can do a lot more of the stuff myself. Because the worst bit for me about being a landlord is trying to get tradespeople to do small jobs. You can get them for the big refurbs, and because I want to be able to get things repaired more quickly, and even if that means rolling up my sleeves and doing it myself.
No, and that's great, and it's So I think I see myself as this might make some people laugh, but I see myself as something of a sort of peacemaker, and I want to promote understanding between both groups, and the fact that actually, if you've got an extremist view on either side, it's not going to end well. I've witnessed landlords speaking in the worst terms about their tenants. I mean, it's been absolutely shocking the way they've spoken about their tenants as though they're almost livestock. Shocking. I've overheard it in pubs and places. And I've also heard tenants speaking about how much they don't care about the land or their property, and that they know that they're letting they've got problems and not reporting about them because they don't care, because the landlord's just this, that, and the other, and they get name calling. But those always end badly for both people, I think. And where was I going with that? I've lost my train of thought now. But
I also think that and I bought a property a few years ago, and the what's called the EICR, that's the Electrical Installation Condition Report, was unsatisfactory. There were tenants living there, so it means the electrics weren't safe, and the landlord hadn't done anything about it. And I think good riddance. I'm really pleased I bought that property. And one good thing with the Renters Reform Bill, whether it's 1.0 or the red 2.0, hopefully it will make the bad landlords, the criminal landlords, leave, because it's going to be a lot harder for them to hide their bad deeds, and will make it better for everybody else, because the overwhelming majority of landlords are good. There are bad ones around, but why? If you're running a business, you want it to be successful, and it's just like if you have a car, you want to get it serviced, otherwise it will break. And that's what landlords need to do with their houses. They need to get things looked after, and then they'll last longer and everyone's happy.
I've always think that in any commercial relationship of any kind, if both sides work on the actual relationship, but it will last a very long time. If either side's got an unfair advantage, it won't last. If
Yeah.
either side feels at a disadvantage, the relationship will break down and the relationship will come to an end. And that's why, if as a landlord you want tenants to stay for a long time, and if as a tenant you want to stay in your home for a long time, be reasonable.
Mhm.
Talk. Ask questions that you might be afraid to ask. Just ask the question. Ask politely. Don't ask in a threatening way. Something else I see happening a lot is people who are nervous and afraid of what might be a difficult conversation, and they immediately take a sort of offensive or slightly antagonistic and hostile approach. We're upset because this has happened, and unless you do this, we're going to. And that's like straight out of the gates. And you can always see those people, because that's clearly someone who's just inexperienced at having what might be a difficult conversation and is approaching it the wrong way because they're afraid they're not going to get what they want. Rather than, as I would say this, whichever side you are, landlord or tenant, if there is an issue to discuss, I'd always open it by just saying, is there a time that we could discuss this topic?
Yeah, I think, and I'm not, I don't think it says landlord versus tenant. What people should do is think, what is fair and reasonable? I have adult children. I would want my children's landlords to treat them fairly. I do the same with my tenants. And I think that if you're a landlord, you need to be professional. You need to get training. NRLA do some really good value training courses. There's all the stuff on my blog as well, but, become an accredited landlord with the NRLA. And then you know what your obligations are. Be fair, be reasonable. I had somebody who'd signed up for one fixed term, and then she signed up for another fixed term for 12 months. She wanted to leave halfway through because she was having money trouble. I said, yeah, fine, you can go. It's no problem. I didn't try and get the money from the guarantor. There were no rent arrears. I just let her go, and she went and moved in with her mum, and that was during COVID, and that was fine. And the thing is that there are lots of landlords like me that do this. Nobody writes about it because it's not very interesting.
Yeah.
And it's far better to say, oh, this slum landlord, this, or this bad tenant, that. But the overwhelming majority of people have good relationships. The properties are in good order, and hopefully when the Renters Reform Bill comes through, if it does, well, it's a question of time. If it doesn't come through with the Conservative Party, assuming Labour win, something will come through. There's a lot of measures in it that are really fair. And there's a new ombudsman scheme that's being set up, so tenants can go and complain to the ombudsman rather than going to court, which I think is really good. Tenants can have the right to request pets as long as the pets are reasonable. I allow my tenants to have pets anyway. I think they'll probably have them anyway because I just take them out when I come round, because it's nice for a family to grow up with pets, and there's a little bit of wear and tear, but they stay longer, and it doesn't bother me. I'm going to redecorate anyway when they leave. There's also a really good thing called the PRS database, which is the property portal. It means when a tenant wants to let a property, they'll be able to go on and see, do they have the good electrical report? But importantly, the local authorities will be able to see it as well. So they'll be able to see, oh yes, this house, their electrical report has, the ICR has expired, and they can take enforcement action, assuming they have the funds to do that. So it's a shame that the Renters Reform Bill has got bogged down into this discussion about no fault evictions, because there's a lot of other good things in it. There's way more offences for landlords, a decent home standard, and a rolling periodic tenancies, which means that tenants won't be locked in to long-term agreements. So like the person who wanted to move in with her mum, she would have just been able to give me a couple of months notice and could have left. She wouldn't have to have worried about whether or not I was going to release her.
If it happens, if the bill gets passed, is it true and fair to say that without a functioning court system, unless they put in some kind of ombudsman to handle the minor disputes, then it's not actually going to make any difference without a court system there to back up when the disputes do arise?
So the ombudsman is going to allow tenants complain about landlords, not the other way around. If with the thing about section 21 is that a landlord can just serve 2 months notice and not give a reason. They don't have to justify anything. Under the new system, well, it's a system that's there already, but is not used so much. The landlord's going to have to prove that they have a ground to terminate, like they want to move in themselves or they want to sell. And they'll have to go to court. And the judge will just have to decide whether or not they believe the landlord and have to provide evidence, and then they'll have to go through the process. And if the tenants decide not to move out unless the bailiffs come, that will happen. So that is going to be a lot more work and more expensive for landlords. But the overwhelming majority of tenancies don't end like that. Most tenancies, the tenant leaves and moves on. It's certainly been my experience, apart from when I sold one property a few years ago. And so it's the tenants that decide to leave. And so it's only it's only a problem for landlords if they are wanting to take possession of their property, and they're going to have to prove that, say, somebody's got antisocial behaviour. You're going to have lots of evidence for that. Whereas at the moment they can just serve a Section 21 notice, and the good landlords, which are in the majority, they don't want to terminate their agreements with their tenants, because you lose money in between your voids. You've got to pay agents and all that sort of thing. We much rather have people stay, and the way to making people stay is by making the properties lovely and looking after them. So.
Yeah, exactly. Now we've got some questions. Lots of questions I'd like to get through. If you've got any questions specifically about the Renters Reform Bill, please put those in. Put question at the beginning of your live chat comment. If you've got any questions as a tenant or as a landlord that you think are quite general questions that would be interesting for everyone to hear the answer to, put those in as well. And let's now take a couple of comments that started. So it's an interesting one. Here's the first question, the political one. 10,000 subs with no vids says, that's a strange YouTube name. Do you think things will get better or worse for landlords if Labour get in?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because if we'd been asked 10 years ago and somebody described the Renters Reform Bill and they'd said, oh, is this a Labour policy or a Conservative policy? They'd have said, oh, that's a Labour government. So some would say that this policy is more Labour. I think it's a bit difficult to say because we haven't seen the Labour Party manifesto, and a lot depends what's in it. I don't know if they're going to be rent controls, which would be a disaster. It has been a disaster in Scotland. We don't know what they're going to say. So I think it's probably unlikely that they will go softer on landlords than the Conservatives. But you've got to bear in mind that the Conservatives are actually bringing in a lot more obligations for landlords. But the thing that nobody's talking about is, what about the regulation of letting agents? There are so many
that's a really good point.
Incompetent and unqualified letting agents out there. I'm speaking from direct experience here. There are qualifications that letting agents can have, but a lot of them don't have them. And the landlords have so many regulations where anyone can set up as a letting agent as long as they're not a criminal, and they might not know the first thing about all the ins and outs about your electrical, all of the compliance things you have to do.
It's 160 laws or something that apply to landlords, aren't there? So yeah,
and it's more than that with the Renters Reform Bill. And what I'd like the Labour government to do, because the Conservatives have sat on it, there was a report done a few years ago called the Regulation of Property Agents, because it's not just letting agents, it's also the agents who estate agents and also managing agents for freehold properties, and they've not done anything about it. And so I think actually, if they want to see positive change in the PRS, they need to raise the professional standards among the professionals, many of whom do not have any qualifications at all.
Well, I can speak from personal experience as someone who's been selling estate and lettings agency software to estate agents for over 20 years. as well as the hundreds of clients I actually did get, I've met many hundreds, if not thousands more in my sales pitches over the years to those guys. And I think it's interesting because there are two things I'd note, which is that where you have what I would call a professional landlord, I would class you as a professional landlord because you're choosing to do everything yourself and run it as a business. So you're actually doing it as a profession. Then yes, I know that you don't use an agent, do you? You tried, but now you don't anymore. That's actually, in some respects, that's better for the tenant because they've got a direct relationship with you, not through some shocking lettings agent. Having said that, where you've got some landlords who've accidental landlords, maybe they've been posted abroad for a while, or some other reason that they're going to move out, and they have to rent out their home, and they don't know anything about it. At that point, that's when you really do need a good lettings agent. Now, the problem with all the regulations is unenforced regulations are as bad as no regulations at all. That's what we've got at the moment, basically no enforcement or very, very little enforcement. I think that the idea I've heard that I like the most is that if you want to be a landlord and run it yourself, then you need to be a licensed landlord. And if you're not a licensed landlord, then you need to use a licensed letting agent. I think so that landlords still have the choice of let's go. But I do think that when you are involved in the operation of the industry of providing people with their homes, it is so much more important than just a commercial thing. It is a social thing. It massively affects society as a whole, that it almost needs licensing more importantly than the estate agency side needs licensing.
I mean, I agree that it is a huge social responsibility, and there are accreditation schemes for landlords. I'm an accredited landlord. I've done the training with the NRLA, and I personally wouldn't see anything wrong with it being a requirement for landlords to become accredited. And in fact, a lot of local authorities require that, where they have areas where they require license, because in some areas you have to have a license, either a selective license or an HMO license. And some local authorities require landlords to be accredited, or at least they give a discount if you're accredited. And I agree that, you know, being a landlord is a serious thing. It's not passive income. You've got to learn all the ins and outs of it, and it involves many different skills, and it's not something to be done lightly.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Now we've got to try and crack through some more of these comments. I'd like to address this comment. Eddie Ward says, rich people renting a flat is fine, but renting to people who have no choice isn't. Eddie, where would those people who have no choice rent if they weren't landlords to rent them from? I'd love to know your serious answer to that question.
Yeah, I mean, just because there is a really obvious thing here, and I blame Margaret Thatcher for the right to buy of council tenants. And the problem is the way it was set up is that the council tenants were able to buy their council house, as does Angela Rayner. But the problem is that the local authorities don't keep the money, and the money's not being reinvested in social housing. And so the stock of social housing has gone down, and the people who should be on social housing actually are on huge waiting lists. Yeah. And so that, you know, that is the whole problem. Absolutely. Is that so long as that people can buy their council house at a discount, then why would local authorities build more if they're just going to have to go through all that and sell it? So yeah. I think that is actually the core of a lot of the problems, that people who can't afford to rent are ending up in the private rented sector, whereas they should be in social housing.
Yeah, and again, I think if they want to sell off someone, if someone's been a long-term tenant in a home and there's been a council flat for a long time or a council house for a long time and they want to buy it, in principle, that's okay. They can then take it on and do the maintenance themselves. But I think the rule should be, for every one council house you sell, you have to replace it with 2 new ones.
Or at least hold them for 10 years or something like that. Yeah. And the problem is that the social housing stock has depleted and nothing's replaced it. And if the Labour do get in, well, hopefully there will be more social housing built. I know Angela Rayner has talked a lot about that, and I think that would be very good.
Nick Jones makes an observation that there is a difference between landlords who acquire existing property versus other landlords who convert or build new and increase the current stock of housing. Interesting comment. Yeah. Daisy Chains to Buttercups says, paying £1,000 a month and not providing standard quality fit for purpose is not acceptable. Agreed. Law should be covered that the
Yeah,
landlord has a duty
law
of care.
does exist. Yeah, that there are lots of laws. There's the Home Fitness for Human Habitation Act 2018. There's the Landlord and Tenant Act 1985, Section 11. There's all the things to do with hazards. That the law is there, and the landlords do have a duty of care, and the local authority should be taking enforcement action if landlords are not providing properties that are fit for people to
But
live
they're
in.
not, are they?
No, but then that's that's another issue, and then hopefully the local authorities will be funded properly,
Yeah.
and will take action against the rogue landlords, because it's bad for everybody, and that some local authorities are better than others, and there have been a crackdown by some, but there's no shortage of laws, and I read them.
Yeah. Here's a question for you. Billy Big Calls on YouTube says, I'm skeptical that new legislation, if passed, will not stop the landlords from giving notice whenever they want. Just say they want to sell the property or family move in when reality is different. So he's saying, is it actually going to stop landlords just wanting to take the
Well,
property when they
the
want?
thing is, if a landlord uses the new ground under Section 8 to try and sell the house, the landlord is going to need to provide evidence of that. And if they lie to the court, they're in contempt of court, which is serious. So yes, it is really very serious. So of course, there may be some who try to game the system, but they will actually have to prove it to the court, and presumably there'll be a way of following up if it turns out to be a sham. But then on the other hand, sometimes it is difficult, as you know, Charlie, to sell houses when they're priced too high, because they've listened to an estate agent who just wanted to get you. See, I do listen to your things. And so a landlord might be acting in good faith, and it might take a long time to sell the property. I know of properties nearby landlord selling, and it's taken 8-9 months because they wanted too much money for it. But anyway, that's another story. But they did sell it in the end.
Got some great questions coming in here. So that's an investment question. We're not going to go there. Sorry, let me see. I'm doing this on the fly. Paddington Mouse on YouTube says, why is selling up a reason to issue a Section 21 to a paying tenant? Because we don't close a business when we sell it. In other words, why not sell it with a tenant in? Why do you have to get the tenant out?
We don't have to get a tenant out. It's the landlord does have the choice. What landlords normally get more money if they sell it with vacant possession, but it is actually better to try and sell it with somebody in there. And at the moment, it is perfectly legal to sell, to serve notice and sell a property with vacant possession, and that right is going to be retained if the current version of the Renters Reform Bill goes through. So I think it's because people can't be forced to keep something, and that they, as the law stands at the moment, have the right to serve notice, and that's what the law says now.
Okay, thank you. Urban Achiever asks, how do you feel about 3 or 5 year rental agreements?
I know that they're quite popular among build to rent. There are these big lovely things. I know that some people do like certainty, but also I think a lot of people don't know what's going to be happening in 3 to 5 years' time, and they like to have flexibility. So I personally don't offer 3 or 5 year agreements. The standard I offer is 12 months, and then at the end of the 12 months, they can either go into another 12-month agreement, or they can stay on a rolling contract. I don't mind, and I'm not going to terminate as long as they keep paying the rent. I'm not selling up. So I think it just depends on the individual circumstances, and it does tend to be with city and new build that 3 to 5 year rental agreements, but they will be abolished in the Renters Reform Bill, because everything is going to be going onto a rolling contract. So the tenant will be able to terminate at any time with 2 months' notice. There is a discussion at the moment whether the tenant would need to wait 4 months before serving 2 months notice, so in other words 6 months notice, but there won't be the standard 12-month agreements now, or the 3 or the 5-year agreements. And certainly evidence was given to the select committee but by the build to rent sector, saying that this is a problem for their business models. But so far the rules haven't been changed, and so everything's going to be rolling in the future if it ever hits the statute book.
Yeah, if it ever does. I mean, I have to say, if I was going to bet money on this, I would bet plenty of money that it's not going to make it through the statute or onto the statute books before the next election. I don't think it is.
It really is running out of time, and they could have done it, because the leasehold and freehold reform bill was introduced in November, and it's already in the House of Lords, because it has to go through the House of Commons, and then it has to go through the House of Lords, and then there's a ping pong, as they call it, and there are new amendments that are tabled all the time, and it does take a bit of time, particularly something complex like that changes a lot of legislation like this.
Okay, we're going to keep going with these questions. Here's a simple one. Actually, there's a comment from, again, Billy Big Calls, says, I have a very good landlord, been in the same property for 15 years. He's honest with me, respectful, and does any repairs almost immediately. There are good and bad landlords. Quite right. Absolutely agree.
Oh, that's lovely to hear.
And that is also why it's really unhelpful when you see this endless landlord bashing in the media, like they're all evil. It's actually very unhelpful, because as with any industry, you never have them, they're all bad. I mean, you might get people who have a number of repeat bad experiences, and that's bad luck, but it just means you haven't found a good one. Argy Bargy asks you a question. Do you charge extra for pets? I have 2 dogs, and rentals want to charge £25 per month per pet on top of the rent.
So the problem with pets at the moment is, a few years ago the government introduced a cap on the amount of a deposit that a renter needs to give. It's 5 weeks, and a pet can do a lot of damage in 5 weeks. A lot of damage to a property, and 5 weeks rent wouldn't cover new carpet, for instance. And so what the Renters Reform Bill is proposing is that landlords can either ask tenants to take out insurance or take out insurance themselves as a way of making sure that the landlord doesn't have to repair lots of damage. It's perfectly legal to pay to charge more. £25 per month is not an unreasonable amount. It's perfectly legal, and I think in terms of whether people do, it depends on what rent they're asking, whether it's the market. So it is legal to ask for a relatively small extra amount like that. Once the Renters Reform Bill comes in, assuming it does, landlords will have more protection because they can actually get insured. But we can't ask for more deposit at the moment because that's illegal.
Thank you. RG Bargy again says, my landlord developer, so landlord/developer, booting out 6, some in their late 80s, so they can flatten the bungalows and build new expensive houses. My neighbors were told home for life. Okay, so he's talking about the fact that the tenants were told they'd have a home for life, but actually they've been kicked out to replace them. Yeah, it is a fact of life, isn't it, eventually, that some properties eventually do need to be renovated, restored, or whatever, and some landlords want to do this. I mean, I genuinely think that if I was a landlord and I had old crumbling properties that needed to be replaced, I would just probably give the tenants as much notice as possible, like 2 years even, and just say, listen, just heads up, it's going to be a while away, but I'm going to have to knock these down. Take your time, no rush, but please, you're going to need to find another home. A couple of years from now, it's going to happen. And no one can complain with that much advance notice. And again, landlords, I think, should do that with tenants. Just let them know, give them as much, just do unto others as you would be done by, right? Just if you were there, what would you want to know? So, unfortunately, it does happen. There are genuinely legitimate reasons why sometimes long-term rented houses do need. I mean, actually, I've got a friend and he's there for 10 years. And there was a generational shift in the family, and they wanted to take it back into the family after 10 years. But they gave him a year's notice. They told him a year They told them a year in advance of putting it on the market.
It's a really decent thing to do. I think it is particularly tough evicting or serving notice for people in their late 80s. That does sound really awful.
Yeah.
You can just imagine what it would be like for them. But I think if sometimes people's priorities change, they might not want to be a landlord anymore. Nobody can force landlords to carry on being landlords. But if landlords do want to sell up, then they should give people as much notice as possible. And what you say, the golden rule is the same. You know, how would you feel? You know, if you're a landlord, you should treat your tenants as if they're how you would want your children, you know, your parents, your grandparents, your siblings to be treated. And that is definitely the way to go.
I would like to make an important point that a lot of people don't know about this. If you're tenants and you are being forced to leave by your landlord when it's against your preference and you're fully paid up, I discovered this talking to local councils, talking to them about trying to find a way to guarantee rent for people. Anyway, it's a scheme. I discovered a couple. So the number one thing that really shocked me was that 1/3 of all new official homelessness cases are caused by landlords evicting tenants who are up to date on their rent and haven't broken the contract. So they are no fault. And that seems like a horrible situation. So people who are working, paid up in their rent, they've been a really good tenant, and when the landlord Section 20 wants them to leave and they cannot find anywhere else because the market's changed, and they end up actually officially, this is the council accepting them as homeless. So 1/3 of all new homelessness cases are from Section 21. Now, I'm not saying that those landlords don't necessarily have legitimate grounds for reclaiming their property, but that's a situation I think is quite badly handled. But for those tenants, it's amazing how people don't know this. If you are a reasonable person and your landlord says, look, I need you out by this certain date, and you get out voluntarily, you automatically exclude yourself from council help. They will classify you as intentionally homeless unless you stay until the day the bailiffs move you out.
Yeah.
It's very, very important. And I've heard so many horror stories of reasonable tenants who voluntarily left because they were decent. They didn't want to, but they thought, okay, we're going to have to, we don't want to wait for the bailiffs, and didn't know that would allow the council to say, sorry, you're intentionally homeless. We're not going to help you. And it really shocks people. I was shocked the first time I heard that. I couldn't believe it.
It is a really crazy rule. And I think it's because there's just not enough a temporary accommodation for people in that situation. So you have a lot of landlords who are selling up because of the changes to the tax. I know landlords that are losing money every month because their mortgage has gone up and they're having to pay tax on profits because they can't set off their mortgage interest. I've read Vicky Spratt's book, Tenants, and she has several chapters where she explains what it's like for tenants who are in the position they've done absolutely nothing wrong, and their landlord is selling up for whatever reason, yet they can't get any help from the council until the bailiffs come, and then they don't know when the bailiffs are going to come because there's a delay in the court system, and it's bad for their mental health and all these different things, and it's dreadful. I mean, I think it would be a wonderful idea if landlords could serve notice, and that if that happened and it was a valid notice, then the council would actually look at their case for rehousing then, and not actually wait until the bailiffs turn up, because it's just a waste of court time, and it's a big toll on the mental health and the stress of the tenants and of the landlords. And I think I really recommend the book Tenants for any landlords out there. It's good for us to see things from a different perspective, and whilst I might not agree with absolutely everything, it's still a really good perspective.
I think that again, the councils have had their budgets cut and cut and cut. They are the amount of temporary accommodation available is generally not enough when they need it. and the costs that they have to pay for the temporary accommodation make no sense for the taxpayer whatsoever. Just from a pure financial point of view, if they had spent the roughly, it's getting over £100 million a month right now that the taxpayer is spending on temporary accommodation, and imagine how many homes you could build, like decent social homes, livable apartments, even if they are what some people might call halfway homes. They're not intended to be permanent long-term homes, but they're really suitable accommodation to allow you to get back on your feet and then back into the private rented sector, wherever you want to get, rather than living in a hotel room where you cannot live. You just can't live. Like, yes, you've got somewhere to sleep, but you need a kitchen. You need to be able to cook for yourself. You need to be able to. So it's so horrifically mismanaged, the whole thing, and it was so avoidable. It was predictable, avoidable, and a horrific waste of taxpayer money. And I think history will look back on this as one of the biggest failures of this government, this likely outgoing government. Right, questions are still coming in, so I'm trying to get the ones. Here's a very good one. Alia K says, is it normal to get re-referencing done on a tenant who has lived in your property for 7 years without any missed payments?
Well, that does sound really strange. Well, I don't understand why a landlord would do that if they've never been in arrears. I can't see the logic in that. It seems daft to me.
I've not heard of that happening before either. I mean, at a guess, I'm wondering if the landlord is worried about that tenant's future ability and may have another tenant they'd like to put in there.
Yeah, but I mean, at the moment, they can just
they shouldn't do it.
21 notice and not reference them. I don't know. It doesn't sound.
I would get advice on that, Alia, because unless it actually says somewhere in the tenancy agreement that they have a right to do that, I think you may have a legitimate grounds to push back and say, why, under what basis, on what grounds do you require this when I've never missed my rent?
Yeah, I can't think what legitimate grounds there would be. The tenant would only. I don't think that there would be an agreement, a term in an agreement giving the landlord the right. But it just from a common sense point of view, it just seems really strange. So, yeah, I agree.
Got some interesting comments here. Someone called Sib says, we were a week from homeless. I can't imagine that.
Oh,
that's awful. Ricky Heath says, very difficult to find a new rental once you're over retirement age. From a landlord's point of view, what's your take on that? I mean, I would have thought that if someone who's retired has the required income and creditworthiness, actually, they might be quite a good tenant.
Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't mind letting my property to people who are retired. I don't like to talk about my renters, but one because I respect their privacy. But I have one person who rents for me who's older than the average tenant, whilst not retired, and I'll be happy if she lives there forever because she's wonderful. So yeah, but I can imagine it's just like it's difficult to get a mortgage when you're in your late 60s. I imagine it's the same type of thing, but certainly from my perspective, if somebody can afford the rent, then if you're older, you'd be an ideal tenant.
There's one question here I want to. I'll come back to because it's another whole discussion topic, but. Actually, Andy Miller says the letting agent kept apologizing for the state of the property. It was a managed let, but the landlord would do nothing about the damp or mold. Wow, total crook. I mean, to any tenants watching this who are living in properties, because I've heard stories where they're afraid of reporting it to the council because they think they're going to get thrown out if they do that.
Yeah.
What would your advice be to any tenant in that situation?
It is a real problem. It is a landlord's obligation to sort out damp and mold. I know that there are landlords who their first reaction is to blame the tenants. I've had damp and mold in some of my properties, and it's like whack-a-mole. It is difficult to sort out, and it's never just the tenant not opening the window. Like for one of my properties, it turned out there was a leak in the roof. There was a condensation problem, and I changed the radiator, got a better radiator, put anti-condensation paint, and touch wood, it's gone. But landlords should take it seriously, and it is actually a legal obligation for them to sort it out. And to get to the bottom of it, the government published some guidance next. Last year, I've written a really long blog post on it. It is a problem with older properties, and there are lots and lots of things you can do, and even get something called a PIV, which is a kind of ventilation unit. That landlord who doesn't sort the damp and mold is breaking the law. And
is a tenant within their rights to withhold their rent if the landlord is not meeting their obligations?
Yes. It would. I think
an eviction hearing. If I was a judge in an eviction hearing, the landlord says, "Right, I'm evicting because they haven't paid your rent," and the tenant says, "I didn't pay my rent because they didn't fix the damp," and then the landlord, the judge, is not going to grant an eviction notice, are they?
Well, for the discretionary grounds, the judge could take that into account. And this is, I'm not an eviction law specialist, but I think that if property's in a state of disrepair, then they should report it to the council. The council can bring proceedings against the landlord, bring an improvement notice, and if the landlord doesn't sort it, then actually the tenant can apply for a rent repayment order, which means that they could get back a year's worth of rent. And with the Renters Reform Bill, that's going to double. So, and there's the Shelter website, if there's anyone here who's in that situation. The Shelter's website is really good. I looked at the legal stuff.
I've got that link right here. Yeah. I'm going to put it straight in the live chat.
So yeah, there's a landlord who's recommending Shelter, but Shelter do a fantastic service, and I've read a lot of their website on all the legal things, and there's lots of really good advice for people on that situation there.
My position with Shelter is that they do provide a lot of very, very good advice, but if you look at their accounts, their operating costs are an absolute joke. How much money they spend doing it is just a shameful waste of a combination of taxpayer money and charitable donations. It's just, yes, they do a really important role. They've got an important job, but Shelter are also behind a lot of the reforms that have actually hurt the PRS. And as lobbyists, I'm not sure they've done anyone a favor. But I don't know. Do you have a position on that?
I don't have a position on the political side. I just respect the content on their website. It's legally accurate. So
fair enough. Let's not go there then. Okay. Paddington Mouse says, this is obviously an opinion question. Should landlords be required to pay compensation in lieu of notice in a no-fault eviction? It's not a bad question, actually.
It's like with employment law, when someone's being sacked, then get pay in lieu of notice. So you leave tomorrow, but well, I think actually contractually speaking, under the law, a landlord cannot ask a tenant to leave the next day. They have to give a minimum of 2 months notice, and if they don't, then they're breaching the Protection from Eviction Act 1977 and all sorts of other things. If they tried to use unlawful force, then that's another offence which the tenant might be able to get a rent repayment order from. So there should never be a case where a tenant doesn't give notice, and if a landlord does try to do that, they're breaking the law.
Okay, right, one more question, I reckon. Maybe we're going for an hour. Well, if there's more you'd like to say, then please you take as much time as you like. But here's a great question. AJ on YouTube says, we sold our house in 2020 and started renting. We signed an SHT agreement for 12 months.
Is that an AST?
AST, I think they mean, right?
Short hold tenancy.
assured short hold tenancy, AST agreement, let's assume it's that, for 12 months, but never signed another one since. The property is owned by a farmer. Where does that leave us legally?
Well,
So I assume
well,
it goes in periodic, doesn't it?
I mean,
Automatically.
assuming it's a short hold tenancy, then it automatically becomes a periodic tenancy, a rolling one, and depending on the actual terms of the tenancy, it'll either be a statutory one or contractual one, but it amounts to the same thing, that you have the same rights that you would do if you had another fixed term agreement. The only thing is in a fixed term agreement, a landlord can't serve notice in that fixed term, but as soon as it expires, then they can serve notice. So it is perfectly legal to do that. And in fact, the Renters Reform Bill is going to make that the norm, that the only way that they'll all be rolling on a monthly basis.
So, and in this situation, am I right that the landlord is required to serve 2 months' notice, but the tenant only has to serve 1 month's notice?
At the moment, but that is going to change with the Renters Reform Bill, that the tenant will have to serve 2 months' notice, and the landlord won't be able to do 2 months' notice. They'll have to do the Section 8, the grounds for possession that I've been talking about.
Suzanne, this has been fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. We've got 750 people watching us as we speak now, which is quite something. Plus a few more other things that it doesn't count as well. But so where can everybody find you?
Sure. So my blog is called theindependentlandlord.com. I do a weekly newsletter. I do have tenants who subscribe, and because I try and make my content objective, and so it's not biased in front of in favor of tenants or landlords, and but it does encourage landlords to to comply with their responsibilities and be good landlords, almost every single blog post. So theindependentlandlord.com. I'm on Instagram, indie landlord, so indie_landlord, and I'm on Twitter, indie_landlord. I'm going to be launching a podcast soon, weekly podcast, but the name's still under wraps for that. So watch this space, and what we're going to be talking about each week are practical things for landlords, to help them know and ask questions, help them know what they need to do to be good landlords and comply with all the laws, and provide fantastic properties for people to live in.
Fantastic. Well, there are links to those, your Twitter profile, your Instagram profile, and your website are linked to below in the YouTube, and I think it'll be in Facebook and in LinkedIn descriptions, but not on Instagram. And if you're watching this later on TikTok, I know you won't because it's out of the first 10 minutes, so that's and if you listen to this on the audio podcast, all the links below that we've just described are in the show notes of the podcast, wherever you're listening to it as well. Suzanne, if you could say one thing to landlords, like just one thing, and that's the last thing you could ever say to landlords, and then one thing to tenants, what would you say to them as a group of people?
Well, I would say the golden rule, which is what you said before, is just to do the right thing and be fair and treat people fairly. And I think it's the same with tenants. Is be transparent and open with your landlord. If you have problems, you can speak to the landlord, and then hopefully you get this really positive relationship. And that I hope should be the norm, and it's something that we should encourage.
Absolutely. I agree with that. I've always found just a reasonable approach is the fastest way to resolve issues as they arise. Just talk about it. Just talk, sit down.
It doesn't sell newspapers, they say, oh, landlord says you've got to be a good landlord and look after your tenants. No one's going to want to read about that.
That's true. That's very true. Well, everybody, thank you very much for watching. Thank you to Suzanne for your time. Really appreciated it.
Thank you for all the questions.
I hope you'll come back again another time. I'm sure there'll be plenty more questions. Thank you to all of you for your questions. I'm sorry about the ones we didn't get to answer. But in the meantime, I'm going to wrap up with my view about the general rental market at the moment would appear to be softening. Mm-hmm. We had Chesterton talking about 10% asking price drops in rents recently. I've seen rental prices dropping in patches around the country. There are always places where they just don't drop because there's always too much demand. But I think the really sharp rises that we saw are now receding. And Okay, let's end with a bombshell. If rent prices do go down, you're gonna hope your tenants aren't watching this. If rent prices do go down and a tenant that was out of the fixed period came to you and said, "Hey, look, rents have actually come down a bit. Would you mind if we knocked a little bit off my rent just so it's fair with the fair market rent?"
Well, for existing tenants, I've not been putting the rent up to market. So
Okay.
they are. I put them up a little bit, and one I did today was like 3.4%, and which is a long way
Way
behind
below.
inflation. So I just try and be reasonable. It has to go up a little bit because my costs go up,
Yeah.
but I'm not being one of these people putting it up by 10, 20%.
No.
I'd just rather put up a small amount. And what I say on my blog is to keep it under wage inflation. And if I
Yeah.
have a tenant who's in the public sector, I'll keep it below that, because I want them to be able to afford the rent and also afford to save a bit of money as well. So I'm not one of these people who just squeezes the sponge to get the last bit out. No, that's not the right thing to do, in my view.
There's a name I recognise on the comments at the end. Not 25% then. I like her. That's from Alex Groundwater. Hello, Stiggy, who's joined me.
3.4%. Goodness me.
Listen, guys, thank you very much, everybody. And we'll see you on the next one. And don't forget, you can get this everywhere, all the socials. You can find me, Moving Home with Charlie, on any social as well. Thanks for following me. I'll see you on the next video. Bye.